There's a moment, and I know every soldier who survived those early days knows exactly what I'm talking about. There's a moment right before everything changes where the air just goes quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get on a Sunday morning when nobody's awake yet. The kind of quiet that precedes something enormous. Something that cannot be undone. I was 23 years old the first time I stood on soil that wasn't Earth's. And I want to tell you, I need to tell you that nothing we trained for prepared us. Nothing. Not the simulations. Not the briefings. Not the 6 months of zero-gravity conditioning they put us through in the orbital station above Nevada. Not the psychological evaluations or the lectures from the xenolinguistics teams or the very, very confident generals who stood at podiums and told us the galaxy was manageable. None of it. Because the galaxy, as it turns out, had not been waiting for us to be ready. My name is Corporal, well, it was Corporal back then, Darian Voss. 3rd Battalion, 7th Rapid Response Division, Earth Expeditionary Force, which is a title that sounds very official and very impressive until you understand what it actually meant in the early days of galactic contact. It meant we were the ones they sent first, which meant we were the ones most likely to come back wrong, or not at all. I'm telling you this story because I was there. Because I watched it happen with my own 2 eyes, and I still don't fully believe it. And because the people who write the histories, the ones who turn what we lived through into clean chapters and clear timelines, they always miss the small things. The way Sergeant Havorson chewed on the inside of his cheek when he was scared. The smell of the transport bay when we first broke atmosphere over Cathara IV. The sound, God, the sound of the first alien war drum we ever heard in real life versus in those clean, recorded briefing clips. I want you to hear the real version. Not the version carved into the memorial on the steps of the Interplanetary Senate. Not the version Admiral Chen gives in her speeches every October on Remembrance Day. The real one, the messy one. The one where we were terrified and tired and smelled bad, and still somehow managed to do something that changed the galaxy forever. Chapter 1, The Call That Changed Everything. Let me back up a little. Because before there was a battlefield, there was a message. And before there was a message, there was 18 months of what the diplomatic corps very delicately called first contact negotiations with the Catharan hegemony, and what everyone who wasn't a diplomat called the most politely conducted existential standoff in human history. The Catharans had found us first. That's the part people always forget. They found us. We didn't go out into the stars and stumble onto alien civilizations. They showed up. 3 ships, each one roughly the size of Manhattan Island laid on its side, appearing without warning in high Earth orbit on a Tuesday in March. Just there. Suddenly, on every radar, every telescope, every satellite feed across the planet. I remember that Tuesday. I was doing push-ups in the Fort Bragg training yard when my sergeant's phone went off. And then every phone in the yard went off simultaneously. And then someone's radio started broadcasting something that wasn't music and wasn't static. It was a tone. A very specific, very deliberate mathematical tone that the xenolinguistics people later said was the Catharan equivalent of knocking on a door. Politely. The Catharans were, and I want to be precise here because it matters, not hostile, not immediately, not at first. They were representatives of something called the Galactic Hegemony Council, which was basically the galaxy's version of the United Nations, except it had actual enforcement capability and several thousand years of history behind it. They had laws, treaties, a whole elaborate system of interstellar diplomacy that had been refined over millennia of contact between dozens of species. And they had been watching Earth for a while. Not in a sinister way, or, well, they would argue not in a sinister way. They watched every emerging civilization. It was standard protocol. You observe, you evaluate, you make a determination about whether the new species is ready for contact, and if yes, you send the delegation. We passed the evaluation, barely from what I later understood. There were apparently some very heated debates in the Hegemony Council about humanity's readiness, centered primarily around our persistent habit of fighting each other and our general attitude toward resources and the environment. But ultimately someone made the argument that we were educable, and the vote passed, and so 3 Manhattan-sized ships showed up in Earth orbit on a Tuesday in March. The 18 months of diplomacy that followed were by all diplomatic accounts going quite well. Humanity was learning Catharan Standard. The Catharans were learning English, Mandarin, and surprisingly good Spanish. Trade frameworks were being discussed, cultural exchange programs. The Catharans were curious about human art in particular, music especially. There's apparently something about the way human brains construct melody that the Catharan xenobiologists found genuinely fascinating. And then the Veth arrived. The Veth are not, I want to be very clear, nice. They are not curious or diplomatic or interested in music. They are the reason the Galactic Hegemony Council has an enforcement arm. They are the reason 47 planets in the outer spiral had gone dark in the 3 centuries before humanity made contact. They are, to use a word that I think captures it better than any technical description, predators. Not in the animal sense. Not because they were driven by hunger or instinct. In the deliberate sense. In the choosing sense. In the we have decided this thing belongs to us sense. They found Earth the same way they found everything eventually. They followed the Catharan ships. Wherever the hegemony made contact with a new civilization, the Veth showed up eventually. Because new civilizations meant new resources, new territory, new, and this is the part that still makes my jaw tighten, new genetic material, because the Veth had a biological imperative built into their social structure around absorbing and cataloging other species' traits. They weren't just conquerors, they were collectors. When their fleet arrived, 17 ships, each one considerably larger than the Catharan vessels, Earth's diplomatic channels went chaotic. The Catharans immediately issued warnings. The Hegemony Council convened in emergency session. There were 48 hours of frantic communication between the Catharan ambassador and every world government simultaneously. And out of those 48 hours came the thing that changed everything. The Catharans asked for our help. Not because they couldn't fight. The hegemony had military capability, significant military capability, but the Veth had something the hegemony had never been able to fully counter, adaptability. Every time the hegemony developed a tactic, the Veth absorbed it within 2 or 3 engagements and began using it back against them. Their biology allowed for rapid assimilation of combat techniques. Their ships adapted their shielding configurations in real time. They were not just collecting species, they were collecting strategies. And they had been fighting the hegemony for 300 years. 300 years of a war where the hegemony kept almost winning and somehow never quite finishing it. 300 years of the Veth retreating, adapting, returning. 47 planets gone dark. Billions of lives across dozens of species, across 3 centuries, and still no resolution. The Catharan ambassador, a being called Tessivar, who had 7-fingered hands and eyes that changed color based on emotional state, and who was honestly one of the most impressive people I ever met regardless of species. Tessivar came to the UN General Assembly in person, stood at the podium, eyes cycling through violet and gold and something the color of deep water, and said, "We need to understand how humans fight." Because in all their centuries of observing emerging civilizations, in all their data on sentient species across the galaxy, they had never seen anything quite like us. Not in the way we constructed weapons, not even in our tactical creativity, though that surprised them too. They had never seen anything like the way humans refused to stop. I didn't hear Tessivar's speech live. I was in a transport truck in the Nevada desert when the recording played over the radio, and I remember the guy next to me, Private Tomás Reyes, who was from Guadalajara and had a little picture of his grandmother taped inside his helmet. I remember Tomás looked at me after the speech ended and said, in this very quiet, very honest voice. You think that's a compliment or a warning? And I didn't have an answer for him then. I have one now. It was both. Chapter 2. KTHRAIV, The World Between Stars. They shuttled us up in 6 waves over the course of 3 days. Standard Earth military transport, modified with Ketharan atmospheric stabilizers, because it turns out the trip through the hegemony's faster-than-light corridor, they called it the fold, does things to the human vestibular system that the designers of Standard Earth transport had not accounted for. Half the battalion threw up. The other half were too scared to throw up. I fell somewhere in the middle. I was fine until we came out the other side of the fold, at which point I was very abruptly not fine, and then I was fine again after about 20 minutes, which I chose to interpret as a personal victory. Kethara IV was the hegemony's primary staging world for this region of space. Think of it as a military base the size of a continent, embedded in a planet that was otherwise covered in something that looked almost exactly like sea glass, smooth, pale green formations that caught the light from the system's twin suns and scattered it in patterns that made the whole planet look like it was quietly breathing. It was genuinely one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen from orbit. On the ground it was loud, chaotic, smelled like ozone and something sweet that I could never quite identify, and absolutely crawling with beings from species I'd only ever seen in briefing documents. Let me try to give you a real sense of what that was like. You're 23 years old. You grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. The most exotic place you've ever been is Cancun for your cousin's bachelorette weekend. You step off a military transport vessel onto the surface of an alien planet, and you are immediately surrounded by, I'm going to list some of them because I think the specificity matters, the Tareth, who are roughly 8 feet tall and communicate partly through subsonic rumbles that you feel in your sternum before you hear them. The Seleni, who are small enough to sit in your palm and travel in large groups that move in perfect synchronization like a murmuration of starlings. The Dravachi, who are insectoid and have 6 limbs but carry themselves with a dignity that makes you feel underdressed. And the Ketharan soldiers themselves, who look distantly humanoid if a human had been designed with the aesthetic of something between a greyhound and a very tall tree, and who move with a precision that made our training look like children playing at soldiers. And every single one of them was looking at us. Not unkindly, not with hostility, with something that I can only describe as cautious curiosity, like they had heard about us, like the reports had gotten back, like they were waiting to see whether what they'd heard was accurate. Sergeant Havorson, who was 6'4" and built like a very irritable wall, and had done 2 tours in environments that would have broken most people. Havorson stepped off that transport and looked around, and I watched his face do something I'd never seen it do before. He looked genuinely, momentarily small. Then he squared his shoulders, hitched his pack, and said, in his particular flat Wisconsin accent, "All right, let's not embarrass the planet." And that was, in many ways, the unofficial motto of the entire Earth Expeditionary Force from that moment forward. Our liaison was a Ketharan officer named Vailsureth Caminos, which we immediately shortened to Commander Caminos, because human mouths are not naturally built for the full Ketharan name structure. Caminos had been a military strategist for what translated to roughly 90 of our years, an age that still makes my brain stall, because Caminos looked no older than maybe 35 by human standards, though the Ketharan relationship with aging is complicated, and I'm not qualified to explain it properly. Caminos was not immediately impressed by us. That's the honest version. The diplomatic version that appears in the official histories is that Caminos approached the human contingent with measured expectations. What actually happened is that Caminos watched our battalion run its first field drill on Ketharan soil, a standard tactical movement exercise, the kind we'd done hundreds of times, and then stood beside Sergeant Halvorsen afterward with those color-shifting eyes gone a very steady, assessing gray, and said, "Your coordination is acceptable. Your physical capability is above the baseline for species of similar size. Your tolerance for environmental discomfort appears genuinely unusual." Halvorsen said, "Is that good?" Caminos said, "I have not decided." It was not an auspicious beginning. Chapter 3. What we learned in the first week. The hegemony's military structure was built around something they called precision doctrine. The idea was essentially this: every engagement should be planned to the maximum possible degree of certainty before it begins. You gather intelligence. You model every possible variable. You do not commit forces until your probability of success modeling reaches a threshold. The threshold varied by species and commander, but Caminos's threshold was something like 83% confidence before engagement. This was not because the hegemony was cowardly. It was because they had learned over centuries that improvisation against the Veth was lethal. The Veth adapted to tactics in real time, so any tactic that you improvised mid-battle would be observed, catalogued, and countered within minutes. The hegemony response was to plan so thoroughly that improvisation became unnecessary. The problem, and this had been the problem for 300 years, was that the Veth also planned thoroughly. They were extraordinarily intelligent. Their pre-battle intelligence operations were extensive, which meant that by the time the hegemony committed to an engagement with 83% confidence, the Veth frequently already knew what the plan was, or some version of it, and had already begun adapting. It was, as one of our generals privately described it, the most sophisticated game of chess in the galaxy, played between two very smart opponents, and resulting, after 3 centuries, in a draw that had cost billions of lives. I learned all of this in the first week on Cathara IV, mostly through Commander Caminos's very efficient and slightly exhausted briefings, which were delivered in Ketharan Standard with a translation earpiece that sometimes had a half-second lag and occasionally translated idioms in ways that didn't quite work. At one point, Caminos said something that translated as, "The Veth are playing cards that do not belong to their hands," which I understood to mean they were cheating, and which I later confirmed was exactly right. But the thing that stuck with me from that first week, the thing that I kept turning over in my head during the long nights on Ketharan soil, listening to the twin suns set with a sound that was less like silence and more like a frequency just below hearing, was something Tessavar said when she came to meet us on day 4. Tessavar had come out to see us personally, which apparently was unusual. The ambassador was not typically a battlefield presence. But she came out, and she walked through our camp in that precise Ketharan way, looking at everything. And at the end of the walk she sat down across from me and 3 other soldiers, just sat down, right there on the ground, which I later learned was considered a significant gesture of informality in Ketharan culture. And she said, "Tell me something true about how humans fight that is not in any report." There was a silence, and then Tamaz Reyes said, without really thinking about it, "We get really, really angry." Tessavar's eyes went that deep-water color, the one I'd come to associate with deep interest. "Explain," she said. And Tamaz, who was 21 years old and from Guadalajara, and had never in his life expected to be explaining human psychology to an alien ambassador, Tamaz leaned forward and said, "You can plan all you want. You can have the best strategy and the best odds, but when things go bad, when it's your friends and it's ugly and it looks like you're losing, something happens. Something kicks in. It's not logical. It's not tactical. It's like we switch gears into something else, something older." He paused, looked at his hands. "I don't know how to explain it better than that, but I've seen guys do things in bad situations that they couldn't physically do in training, like the math just stops applying." Tessavar was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes cycled through several colors I'd never seen her use before. Then she said, "In 300 years of war, we have never encountered a species that performs better when the situation is worst." And she said it the way you say something that has just explained a very old mystery. Chapter 4. The VETH Advance First Contact. They came at Cathara IV on the 31st day. Not the whole fleet. The Veth were not reckless. This was, as Commander Caminos explained with the tight, controlled voice of someone who had been in this situation before, this was a probe. A testing force. 7 ships to our staging world, which was protected by a hegemony defensive grid that was, theoretically, among the most robust in this sector. The probe was also a demonstration. Not just tactical intelligence gathering. The Veth wanted us to see their ships up close. They wanted the new species to understand what they were looking at before any engagement. It was, in its own way, psychological. They were showing us the weight of what was coming. I watched those 7 ships on the orbital display screens in the command center, enormous curved things, black in the way that deep space is black, with no surface detail you could easily make out because they were built to absorb light rather than reflect it. I watched them and I felt something happen in my chest that I don't have a precise word for. It wasn't quite fear. It was more like the sensation of the world becoming very, very real. The sensation of understanding, finally and without any remaining comfort, that this was actually happening. The hegemony defensive grid opened up immediately. Precision doctrine in action. Every shot placed with exactitude, no wasted energy, the mathematical beauty of a military force that had been perfecting this art for centuries. The Veth's lead ship took several direct hits from the orbital platforms. And adapted. Within 4 minutes. 4 minutes of sustained fire, and we watched the shielding configuration on that lead ship literally change shape in real time. The energy distribution pattern shifting, the absorption matrix reconfiguring itself, and the next volley of fire doing perhaps 60% of the damage the first volley had done. Caminos, standing at the command board, did not react visibly. This was, I understood, something they had seen before. The adaptation was expected. The precision doctrine account for it. The engagement modeling had this variable built in. What the modeling had not fully accounted for, or had accounted for but apparently underweighted, was what happened when the Veth finished adapting to the orbital grid and turned their attention to the surface. The ground fire came through the atmospheric shell in a pattern that our instruments described as dispersed saturation, not aimed at military targets, not aimed at command infrastructure, just dispersed, all over, like rain if rain were capable of leveling buildings. The dispersal pattern wasn't meant to maximize damage. It was meant to maximize chaos. And it worked. Communication channels filled with emergency traffic. 3 of the Ketharan fighter wings scrambled and immediately began fragmenting, not because of cowardice, but because each pilot was getting 3 conflicting orders simultaneously from 3 different commanders, all of whom were operating under their own situation assessments, none of which were matching. I looked at Halvorsen. Halvorsen looked at Caminos. Caminos looked at his tactical display with those gray eyes and said, very quietly, "This is the pattern they disrupt. We respond. They absorb the response. The cycle continues." And I heard in his voice, underneath the precision and the professionalism, something I hadn't expected to hear from a 90-year veteran of galactic warfare. I heard tired. Chapter 5. The thing Halvorsen did. What happened next is the part that gets carved into the memorial steps, the official version. Let me give you the actual version. Sergeant Halvorsen pulled up the tactical map. Not the hegemony version, ours. The Earth Expeditionary Force version, which was a slightly rougher interface that our technical teams had been maintaining separately because, honestly, we hadn't fully integrated with hegemony systems yet, and some of our officers were old-fashioned enough to prefer their own tools. Halvorsen pulled up our map, looked at it for about 30 seconds, and then said, "The dispersal pattern, it's not random." Caminos looked up from his board. "Of course it is not random," Caminos said. "It is calculated to maximize systemic disruption." "No," Halvorsen said. "It's a shape. Look." He pulled up the surface impact data, every point where the ground fire had hit, and overlaid them on the map, and then stepped back so Caminos could see. The impacts formed a perimeter, not perfectly geometric, deliberately imperfect, which was why it hadn't been flagged automatically, but a perimeter. And inside the perimeter, the primary communication relay for the planetary defense grid. The dispersal wasn't chaos, it was camouflage. What looked like random saturation fire was actually precise targeting dressed up as randomness. And it had succeeded because the hegemony's damage assessment systems were looking for precision patterns and hadn't caught the deliberately imprecise precision pattern. Caminos stared at the overlay for a long moment. His eyes went through 4 different colors in about 6 seconds. Then he said, with a controlled intensity that I understood was the Ketharan equivalent of alarm, "They have never done this before." Halvorsen said, "They learned it from you." Which stopped everyone in the room. Because Halvorsen was right. The hegemony had used exactly this technique, precise targeting dressed as random dispersal, in the Battle of Veth 3 Secondary about 60 years ago. It had been very effective. The Veth had apparently stored it for 60 years and were now deploying it back. Caminos turned to Halvorsen with an expression I couldn't fully read and said, "How do we respond?" And Halvorsen said, "I remember this exactly. I will remember it forever," Halvorsen said. "You stop responding. You let them think it worked. You cut the relay on purpose, make it look like the plan succeeded. Then you route all communication through our backup systems, Earth systems, ones they have never seen before, ones they have no data on. And while they're sitting there thinking they've blinded you, you see everything they're doing." There was a silence in that command center, the kind of silence that has weight. Then Tessivar, who had been standing quietly in the corner, and who I had almost forgotten was there, Tessivar said, in a voice that was very precise and very deliberate, "You are describing deception as a tactical instrument." Halvorsen looked at her. "Yeah. Not deception of the enemy by superior planning. Deception of the enemy by deliberately appearing to fail." "Yeah. The hegemony does not," Tessivar said carefully, "commonly employ deliberate failure as a tactical instrument." Halvorsen looked at her for a moment, and then he said, in that flat Wisconsin voice, "Good thing you've got us then. It worked. I want to be clear that things don't always work. I want to be clear that the plan that followed was not clean, was not perfect, and cost us. Corporal Jinhee Park was killed when the relay station, the one they deliberately took offline, was hit by secondary fire from the Veth before they could get the crew out. Private Marcus Webb lost the use of his left hand to a piece of shrapnel that came through a wall that was supposed to have been reinforced. 2 Ketharan engineers who were helping reroute the communication lines were injured badly enough to require medical evacuation. I want you to know their names before I tell you about the victory, because that's how war actually works. The victory and the cost exist at the same time in the same space, and anyone who tells you the story without both of them is selling you something. But yes, it worked. The Veth probe sat in orbit believing they had achieved their objective for 47 minutes. 47 minutes during which the hegemony, rerouted through Earth communication systems that the Veth had zero intelligence data on, repositioned their fighter wings, shored up 3 defense points that had been degraded by the ground fire, and got their orbital platforms recalibrated for a second strike configuration that the Veth had no adaptation data for because it was a new targeting algorithm. One of our engineers had written on the fly in a transport bay on a folding table. When the second strike came, the Veth lead ship took damage it did not recover from in 4 minutes, or 8, or at all in the window of the engagement. The probes withdrew. They always withdrew. That was Veth doctrine, apparently. A probe is a probe. You don't sacrifice a probe force trying to turn it into something else. They pulled back, and the immediate threat receded, and Kethara IV was intact. And in the command center, after the withdrawal was confirmed, Commander Caminos did something that I later learned was an extremely significant gesture in Ketharan military culture. He turned to Sergeant Halvorsen and placed both hands flat against his own chest, palms in, which is, the rough translation is something between, I see you clearly, and you have earned something permanent. Halvorsen, who did not know what this gesture meant, nodded once and said, "Hell of a fight." Caminos' eyes went gold. Chapter 6. The debrief and the question no one asked out loud. The formal debrief was 4 hours long and was attended by Commander Caminos, 3 hegemony strategic analysts, Ambassador Tessavar, 2 Seleni representatives who had been embedded with us as observers, and our own battalion's command staff. I was in the room because I was Halvorsen's aide at the time, which meant I carried his notes and sat against the wall and was not technically part of the discussion, which meant I got to hear everything without the pressure of being asked to contribute to anything, which is honestly the best possible position to be in when something historically significant is happening. The hegemony analysts spent the first 90 minutes going over the tactical data from the engagement. They were thorough. They were brilliant. They identified every point in the Veth probe's behavior that indicated the new camouflage dispersal tactic. They mapped how it had been derived from the 60-year-old hegemony technique, and they proposed 4 different protocols for detecting this type of pattern in future engagements. All 4 protocols were detection-based, identification and response. After the 90 minutes, one of the analysts, a Tarith named Vorash Sendau, who communicated partly in subsonic that rattled the table gently whenever he spoke, Vorash said, "If we implement Detection Protocol 3 and combine it with Modified Targeting Algorithm 7 as demonstrated today, our modeling suggests engagement effectiveness increases by 31%. There was a murmur of agreement around the table. And Halvorsen said, from across the table, "What does their modeling suggest?" Silence. Halvorsen said, "The Veth, what does their modeling suggest about what we're going to do next?" Another silence, longer. Caminos said, very carefully, "We do not have access to Veth modeling." "Right," Halvorsen said, "but they have access to ours. Or they'll have access to our new protocols within 2 or 3 engagements, because that's what they do. So what I'm saying is, Detection Protocol 3 is great for today. What are we doing so that Detection Protocol 3 doesn't exist in 6 months, because they've already absorbed it?" The room was quiet in a way that was not uncomfortable, exactly, but was the specific quiet of a group of very intelligent people confronting a question they had been not quite asking themselves for 300 years. Tessavar from the corner said, "The sergeant is identifying the fundamental asymmetry." Everyone looked at her. "We build," she said. "They absorb. We build something new, they absorb again. The cycle is 3 centuries old. We have consistently been unable to build faster than they can absorb, because absorption is, by nature, a faster process than creation." She looked at Halvorsen. "You did something today that is not in any of our models. You used their absorption against them. You created a situation in which the act of absorbing caused them to become blind." Halvorsen said, "Turn their own play against them." Tessavar said, "Precisely, and I want to know if you can do that consistently." Halvorsen looked at the ceiling for a moment. Did that thing with the inside of his cheek, the chewing thing that meant he was scared but wasn't going to say so. Then he looked back at Tessavar. "I don't know," he said, "but I know a way to find out." Chapter 7. The Real Nature of Humanity at War. I am going to tell you something that I've spent years trying to figure out how to say properly, and I'm still not sure I've got it exactly right. There is a thing that happens in human beings when things are bad. I mean genuinely, seriously, existentially bad. Not inconveniently bad. Not annoyingly difficult. I mean the kind of bad where everything you love is at genuine risk and the situation looks like it's winning and you still can't stop. That kind of bad. Something turns on. I've tried to explain this to non-humans and it's hard. It's not courage exactly. Courage is the decision to act in spite of fear, and what I'm describing doesn't feel like a decision, it feels like a mechanism. Like something in the human body that has a switch, and the switch is wired to loss, to the threat of loss, to the moment when the thing you value most is actively being taken. The hegemony had been fighting the Veth with intelligence and precision and careful probability modeling for 300 years. And those things are not wrong. They are good. They are necessary. They saved lives. But there is something they don't account for, and I think the reason they don't account for it is because no other species in the hegemony quite has it in the same form we do. We do not have an off switch when losing. Other species, when a situation reaches a certain probability of failure, begin the calculation for retreat, for preservation, for strategic withdrawal and realignment. This is rational. This is correct often. You don't throw lives at a lost battle. But we, and I want to be honest about this, because I've thought about it a lot and I think it's both our greatest strength and the thing that has caused some of our worst disasters throughout history. We get worse at calculating when the stakes are highest. Not stupider. Worse at calculating. Like the analytical part of the brain gets turned down in something older, something that evolved a very long time ago in very harsh conditions, something that was keeping our ancestors alive before we had language to describe it. That thing gets turned up. And that thing does not know how to lose. It doesn't mean we don't lose. We do, we have. Horribly sometimes, but we lose in a particular way. We lose fighting, and we lose angry, and we lose having done things that the probability model said were not worth attempting. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the thing that shouldn't have worked somehow works, because we did it with the conviction of people who had run out of options and just went. That's what Tessivar was seeing when she watched our first drills. That's what 300 years of hegemony modeling had not fully accounted for. That's what turned the Cathara IV probe, a situation that should have played out exactly the same as 300 years of other probes, into something different. Not tactics, not technology. The specific quality of human desperation, deployed by a sergeant from Wisconsin who grew up hunting deer with his dad and didn't have a model for giving up. Chapter 8. The Mission That Made U.S. Legend. 6 weeks after Cathara IV. The Veth came back, not with 7 ships, with 42. This time it was not a probe. This was a statement. This was the Veth saying, we have evaluated the new variable, we have adjusted for it, this sector is ours. I'm going to walk you through what happened over the next 18 hours as clearly as I can, because it's important that you understand the sequence of it, the way one decision built on the next, the way something that looked like chaos from inside it was actually, looking back, with the benefit of hindsight, something else entirely. The hegemony fleet in this sector had 31 ships. Against 42 Veth vessels, the precision doctrine modeling put their probability of successful defense at somewhere between 38 and 44%. Not good odds. Not catastrophic odds, but not good. And the modeling kept shifting downward as the initial exchange of long-range fire revealed that the Veth had adapted to 4 of the hegemony's primary engagement patterns. 4 patterns. 6 weeks. They had absorbed and countered 4 distinct hegemony tactics in 6 weeks, which was faster than they'd ever adapted before, which Caminos said through clenched jaw was because the Veth had recalibrated their absorption matrix after Cathara IV. We had scared them into getting faster. In the command center, watching this unfold, I felt the temperature in the room change the way temperature changes when everyone in a space simultaneously understands that the situation is serious. Not the artificial cold of fear, something more specific. The cold of people thinking very hard, very fast. Halvorsen had been given a formal advisory role in the Joint Command structure after Cathara IV. Not full authority, this was hegemony space, hegemony command, but an acknowledged seat at the table. He used it. What he proposed over the next 40 minutes, working with our battalion's tactical team and 3 hegemony analysts, and communicating in a mixture of Catharan standard and gestures and hand-drawn diagrams on a surface that was definitely not designed for hand-drawn diagrams, was something that didn't have a name yet. He named it later. He called it the Echo Play. The idea was this: you don't fight the Veth with your best tactics. You fight them with your second-best tactics first. You let them absorb the second-best. You let them adapt to the second-best. And in adapting, in specifically adapting to what you've shown them, you cause them to create vulnerabilities in the configuration they started with. Then you hit the vulnerabilities with the tactics they've never seen. It was, in principle, like fighting someone who mirrors every move you make. You make a fake move. They mirror the fake. Now they're in the wrong position, and you go for the real move. In practice, it was enormously, terrifyingly complicated, because it required the hegemony fleet to deliberately perform at a degraded level, to use tactics they knew the Veth would absorb and counter, without the Veth realizing the degradation was deliberate. Too obvious, and the Veth would recognize the setup. Not obvious enough, and the absorption might not happen in the right time frame. Caminos looked at the plan for a long time. His eyes were gray again. The deep, still gray of someone carrying the weight of 300 years of a war that had cost his people more than I could truly comprehend. Then he said, "If this does not work, we lose this sector." Halvorsen said, "I know. 42 ships against our 31. The moment the fleet is committed to this pattern, retreat becomes very difficult." "I know. You are proposing that we bet the sector on the hope that the Veth will absorb our false tactics precisely enough, and quickly enough, that the true tactics land in a window of vulnerability." "Yes. And if they absorb more slowly than we anticipate, or more quickly, then we'll have to improvise." The word landed in the room with a particular weight, because the hegemony did not improvise. 300 years of precision doctrine had carved improvisation out of their military thinking the way a river carves through stone, slowly, completely. And now a 31-year-old sergeant from Earth was standing there, saying the word like it was a tool he kept in his pocket. Caminos looked at him for a long time. Then he turned to his command board and began entering authorization codes. Chapter 9, 18 hours. I will not pretend I understood everything that happened in those 18 hours as it was happening. I was one person in one command center, watching one tactical display and listening to one communication channel. The battle happened across a volume of space that, from the outside, would have looked like a handful of glitter thrown against black velvet, and I was seeing roughly one corner of it. But I saw enough. The first phase went precisely as Halvorsen had predicted, precisely enough to be almost eerie. The hegemony fleet engaged with their degraded tactics. The Veth absorbed them. The adaptation came in waves. You could see it on the display. Each time the hegemony moved in a way they'd agreed to move, the Veth configuration would shift slightly, realigning, recalibrating, the dark ships repositioning themselves with the fluid certainty of a machine that knew what was coming. They were beautiful in a cold way. That's something I never admitted until much later. The Veth fleet in motion was genuinely, horrifyingly beautiful the way a predator is beautiful, efficient, purposeful, nothing wasted. We watched them absorb 4 false tactics over 7 hours. 7 hours of the hegemony fighting at 3/4 capacity, losing ground deliberately, allowing the Veth to feel the shape of the engagement and reshape themselves around it. 7 hours of Caminos watching his ships take damage they could have avoided, trusting a plan that didn't exist in any hegemony doctrine, proposed by a species they'd known for 2 months. I don't think I fully understood, until those 7 hours, what it cost him to authorize that plan. At hour 8, the signal went out through the rerouted Earth communication systems, still invisible to the Veth, still uncompromised. 3 words in English, because that was what the hegemony communication system still couldn't quite parse at speed, and therefore what the Veth couldn't intercept. Now we go. The hegemony fleet changed. Not slightly, not incrementally. All 31 ships simultaneously, across multiple vectors, pivoting to engagement patterns the Veth had never seen. Patterns our engineers had spent the previous 6 weeks designing, specifically, to exploit the types of configuration shifts the Veth typically made during adaptation phases. Patterns that hit hardest not at the Veth starting position, but at the exact position the Veth had moved into in order to absorb the false tactics. The Veth fleet's beautiful, fluid motion stopped. It was the first time I'd seen it stop. They'd been flowing, adapting, recalibrating continuously for 8 hours. And then the pivot came, and they stopped, and there were 3 or 4 seconds where they were absolutely still in space, and I understood. I felt it rather than calculated it, that those 3 or 4 seconds were the Veth realizing that they were not in the position they thought they were in. That the floor had moved. That what they had absorbed was not what they had been given. The next 6 hours were not clean. Wars never are. The Veth adapted again, they always adapted, but they were adapting from the wrong starting position, trying to counter tactics while simultaneously trying to understand how their own positioning had been used against them, and it was too much at once. The beautiful fluid motion became something more fragmented, more reactive, less certain. At hour 14, 2 Veth ships broke from the engagement entirely, pulled back to the edge of the tactical zone, just sat there. Caminos saw it and immediately tasked a sensor sweep. The Veth ships were not damaged. They were, and this is the word the hegemony analysts used, and they used it with a reverence that told me they had never had cause to use it in reference to the Veth before. They were confused. The Veth did not get confused. In 300 years, the hegemony had never caused the Veth to get confused. Halvorsen, watching the sensor data, very quietly said, "There it is." At hour 17, the Veth fleet began a staged withdrawal. At hour 18, they were gone. 31 hegemony ships, 0 losses. I want to be clear about something. We had losses. Earth losses. 4 humans died in the ground-side operations that ran parallel to the fleet engagement, a supply operation that went wrong when a Veth probe hit a relay station and the crew couldn't get out in time. 4 names: Private Keisha Adams, Corporal Raj Subramaniam, Specialist Fiora DeLuca, Sergeant Major William Osai. I need you to hear those names before I tell you what happened next, because victory is never free and the stories that pretend otherwise are lies. 4 humans, 0 fleet losses, 42 Veth ships driven from a sector they had claimed as already won. And the first time in 300 years that the galactic hegemony had won a major engagement without precision doctrine. Chapter 10, the morning after. I walked outside the command center at hour 18 when the all-clear came through, and I sat on the ground on the surface of Kethara IV under the light of 2 suns, and I did not feel victorious. That's the honest truth. I felt exhausted and strange and a little bit hollow, the way you feel after something enormous and consequential happens, and your body hasn't caught up to the meaning of it yet. Tamaz Reyes came and sat next to me. He had a small piece of metal in his hands, the shrapnel from one of the relay station hits, bent into a rough shape. He was turning it over in his fingers the way he turned his grandmother's rosary over in his fingers sometimes, and he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "You think they'll be back?" I said, "Yes." He nodded, but different. Yeah, I said, different. He thought about that for a while. Different how? I didn't have a good answer. I thought about Havorson in the command center, Caminos' gray eyes, Tessavar saying you perform better when the situation is worst, the Veth fleet going still for 3 seconds in open space. Careful, I finally said. I think they'll be different in that they'll be more careful. Tamaz was quiet. Then, is that better or worse? For us or for them? Both, I guess. I looked up at the twin suns, sitting lower now, making the sea glass formations across the horizon catch the light in something that was almost exactly the color of fire. Better for the galaxy, I said. Harder for us. He nodded like that was the answer he'd expected, put the shrapnel in his pocket. Okay, he said. Okay.